Has anyone ever heard of this idea called the meaning crisis? Yeah? Heard of it briefly in passing, you know? Okay, well, I suppose I already introduced myself, so we'll get stuck in. It starts with this guy, you probably don't recognize, he's called John Vervaeke. He's a Canadian professor of cognitive science at the University of Toronto, with Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is also on this kind of topic of the meaning crisis. Essentially, what's happened since the scientific revolution, this kind of new cosmology that came about, and how that's affected like the human role in the universe, like how we think about ourselves, how we live our lives, and the slightly confusing environment that we have in the West now has kind of resulted from this historical crisis. Okay, so John has a 50-part lecture series on the meaning crisis on YouTube. If you're into that sort of thing, it's 100 hours long. It's very good. I love it, but it's a big commitment, so I'll try to summarize. He also has this book, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is also very good and kind of summarizes the main points. If you want more of a deep dive into the topic, okay? So this is how he describes it essentially. He says, we're in the midst of a mental health crisis. There's an increase in anxiety disorders, depression, despair, suicide, North America, Europe. And that this crisis itself is embedded in all these other, environmental crisis, political crisis. Turn on the TV the next week, there's another crisis. A lot of stuff seems to be kind of breaking down, essentially. And he says this is this deeper cultural, historical crisis, which he calls the meaning crisis, okay? And basically it manifests in people's lives as this feeling of disconnection from yourself, disconnection from reality, disconnection from other people, alienation. A lot of these existential issues like nihilism, anxiety, addiction, alienation, really, they're perennial issues in a sense. There's always a kind of general human meaning crisis, but we have a particular historical one now in the West, and that really goes back, in his opinion, to the start of the scientific revolution. Okay, so anybody recognize this cheeky fellow? Yeah, you should definitely know who this is. That's Nicholas Copernicus, very famous for the discovery of the heliocentric universe. The Catholic Church wasn't a big fan of him at the time, some questionable stuff going on. But basically, a lot of people kind of charted back to this big revolution where the universe used to be structured by God. There was the great chain of being, there was a hierarchy, there was an order to things. And then a couple of early scientists kind of poked holes in that a little bit and were like, okay, there's this other structure. I mean, Copernicus was a theist himself, so were other thinkers like Galileo. They weren't, but they kind of laid the grounds for a kind of secular society that was essentially non-religious. Copernicus was obviously wrong about the heliocentric universe. The universe doesn't revolve around the sun, just so you know. So you can't be geocentric if you want. It's allowed. But he made this argument, and then a lot of evidence started coming in from people like Galileo, who, through extending telescopes, essentially could see the heavenly bodies in a way that weren't seen before. Okay, so this undermined the kind of traditional cosmology for people that had interpreted, say, Genesis as a physical account of the universe. Okay, so these scientific discoveries were kind of started to be put at odds with that. Obviously, the church initially wasn't very receptive to Galileo because they recognized that this conflict was kind of brewing in a way. Galileo, despite giving evidence for the heliocentric universe, sorry, I'm not holding this properly, but the heliocentric universe also started what J.P. Marceau has called the materialist lab leak. Does anybody know what materialism is? Liam?
Well, usually it's associated with communism, but it's kind of, there is no spiritual side to life, it's just material.
Yeah, so Karl Marx very famously had an account of dialectical materialism, was his kind of philosophy. But essentially materialism is the ontological or metaphysical position that what's real is matter, okay? Everything is reducible to matter, something like atoms, something like electrons, it's kind of like dust at the bottom of the universe, and that's where reality is in some sense. That's what's really real. Whereas, as you heard in the talks earlier, in the Christian and the ancient cosmology, God is what's really real, not physical matter in some sense. They're kind of at odds with each other. Like, you can look at the ancient cosmology as assuming God is the ontological primitive, and then modern science starts to assume that physical things are what's really there, okay? So he starts what's called reductive materialism. So what does he mean by reductive, essentially? I like to explain it with this meme. So in reductive materialism, biology can be reduced to chemistry, chemistry can be reduced to physics, and then physics can just be reduced to pure math, and you can explain everything with that, basically. That's the entire, modern scientific project was a reductive materialist project. Galileo imagined the universe without any living things, and then wanted to explain it entirely physically, essentially. If you could map out all the relations within it, and you could explain, how everything works as physical objects. If you think about Isaac Newton, who comes along with his Principia Mathematica. Isaac Newton was also a theist. He wrote 1,000,000 words on religion and alchemy, but famously he derived, this kind of efficient causality universe where you can explain, the motions of planets and things by mathematics. So really, these guys are all theists, but they're building a picture of reality without God. They're building a picture of reality that's just a clockwork universe, what comes later to be known as the mechanical universe, okay? So this is totally at odds with the medieval worldview or the ancient worldview, but it's a universe really that's like a big clock, essentially, with what, Richard Dawkins calls a blind clockmaker, a blind watchmaker. So, it comes from nothing, essentially it's all physical, everything's just atoms bumping off each other, and then we come about through a random process of evolution, pretty much. So, the discovery of the heliocentric universe kind of starts this process, undercuts Aristotelian science, undercuts, the cosmology in Genesis, although, we'll talk about that kind of later on a little bit, but this is the impression people have, essentially, that there's now this mechanical picture of reality, a new science, okay? And it explains the universe naturalistically with mind-independent laws, okay? So we don't have any role within this universe. And materialism assumes that what's the fundamental ontology is the philosophy subject dealing with the nature of reality. If you ever hear someone say ontology or metaphysics, that's the subject. In a Christian metaphysics, we assume God is the ontological primitive. God is what's really real. We're the image of God. God is the original. But in a materialist worldview, they assume matter is what's fundamental. Okay, and so this is a huge change, essentially. And a lot of maybe kind of this. I've enumerated these essentially. But these are like the basic assumptions of materialism. Like God doesn't exist. Everything's physical. Humans arose from animals by a mindless, undirected process. We have no intrinsic value, no free will or purpose. There's no objective morality, no afterlife. It's a pretty grim way of looking at things, unfortunately. But they've kind of held the high ground in a way, like this is the intellectually elite way of I think the hard science, the word hard is doing a lot of heavy lifting there in a sense of we got to be tough in the face of materialism, just accept, life is meaningless and it's pointless and we just got to truck on anyway. But really, it's actually a very thin philosophy. It's very weak when you test it out in some sense. Even just that free will doesn't exist. Who here has made a decision before? Everyone who's ever existed. So, kind of a weird idea to say that that's actually just imaginary. You know what I mean? No, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But this revolution had serious existential consequences. I really like this poem by John Donne, An Anatomy of the World. He says, "New philosophy calls all into doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world spent, when in the planets of the firmament, they seek so many new, they see that this has crumbled out again to his autonomies. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone." Okay? So it's kind of taken what's called, C.S. Lewis called it the discarded image, the medieval image, which is Aquinas' philosophy really, kind of manifests in the poetry of Dante, this beautiful picture of reality, and kind of just saws through the middle of it in a sense and just says, nope, it's all just matter, that's it. And people were really, I think they were really struggling with this in a sense, not initially, but it changed the way they look at themselves. I love this quote by Carl Jung, which is that how different the world was for a medieval person in some sense. They were the center of the universe, eternally fixed, surrounded by a sun that bestowed its warmth on them. They were children of God underneath the loving and the Most High, prepared for eternal blessedness. They knew exactly how to act to rise from a corrupt world to heaven. You knew how to act. It was in your politics, it was in your relationships. Everything was organized by it. And then such a life seems no longer real to us because natural science essentially tried to undercut this whole way, this whole brilliant philosophy really of how to live and what's real. And so this is the basis of the meaning crisis, pretty much. Is like, if you have this materialist philosophy, what's the point of our lives? You know, what are we supposed to be doing? It's like, people run into this in real time, even the no free will thing. I know so many people who have really struggled to be like, well, if I don't have any free will, like, why do anything? Why get out of bed in the morning? Like, why even, care about my own life in some sense? And people become very debilitated by this because it's kind of peddled as like really sophisticated and true, which I don't think it actually is, to be honest. Obviously, this kind of mechanical universe comes to its high point, really, I would say, in the 19th century. I think it also drove the world wars, by the way, which were wars between atheistic superpowers. Communism, as he pointed out, is a replacement for religion, a purely materialistic replacement. So is Nazism in its sense. It's equally as much an atheistic philosophy. And so the meaning crisis has real consequences in the real world, in our geopolitics. And Nietzsche, I mean, when he declared the death of God, he wasn't happy about it. Sometimes he's kind of pegged as being like joyful, but this was his conclusion based on this science, was that the mechanical universe is going to lead to nihilism, which is the lack of meaning, and moral confusion. Because he pointed out that Christianity is a system, and when you remove the faith in God from Christianity, you can't just keep everything else. Essentially, as he said, once you break that out, you lose the whole thing. Okay? And so this is what science was doing. So I think to move to a more positive thing, it's actually not really more positive, it might be worse, but so Christianity, I think you can think of the Christian worldview as having these three layers. Okay, this is what I want to pitch to you. There's a metaphysical layer, which is the ontological, which is God, essentially, a great chain of being hierarchy. And then there's a mythological or narrative layer, which would be the gospel, the stories that make sense of it. And then there's a moral layer that comes out of that. So like how we live our lives, what would be typical morality in a Christian country in a sense. And I think materialism undermined this. It took out the metaphysical layer. And so even within Christianity, there was an attempt to kind of demythologize. You see this with Protestants a lot, to remove kind of the weird elements from Christianity. You know, you're not eating the flesh of God, it's a symbol, or it's something, to kind of demythologize it in a way. A great example of this is the Jefferson Bible. Anybody ever heard of this? Yeah. Thomas Jefferson, he was founding father, president, third president of the United States. He essentially couldn't believe in the miracles or any of the kind of more mythological things in the Bible, and so he chopped them out, basically. He cut them out and he made what's called the Jefferson Bible, which was this kind of censored text, essentially, with nothing that he thought was unusual. And I think that's gone on a lot in certain strands of Christian thinking, might be Protestant to be fair, which is that they've attempted to kind of compete with science within this materialist framework already, but unfortunately, whenever you try and do that, you kind of lose by default. There's no way to win within that paradigm with science because it's so fundamentally different. Okay, the assumptions about the nature of reality within that scientific worldview are completely at odds with the religious, and that's interesting because science came out of religion. Like, it came out of particular Western Latin Christianity, and so. There's been a divergence there in some sense. I think the early theists like Galileo and Copernicus, Isaac Newton, they saw God in God's creation. They looked at the studying of creation as a way to get to God. And then materialist scientists essentially said we can just get rid of God and we'll just look at the creation and we'll control it and we'll predict it. And that'll give us power over nature, essentially. And so, yeah, it's kind of gone away that those early thinkers didn't think it was going to go. And so, yeah, when we lose, Christian metaphysics, our account of reality, but we still try and hold on to Christian morality. And you'll see this a lot in the West, which is secular humanism. Essentially, it's like people want to be, they want to care about the oppressed, they want to care about people who are suffering, they think love is important, but they can't embrace, Christ, they can't embrace the gospel, they can't embrace the account of reality. And so you end up with this quite confused version of Christian humanism, pretty much. And Charles Taylor calls this the supernova, which is that you get all these different interpretations, basically, of what Christian morality is in the West, and all these different positions on things, including things like, communism, Nazism, essentially, which is, communism, I think, is almost like Christian mercy and love without Christianity in some sense. It's just an attempt to politicize in a utopian vision. the stuff that's promised in heaven. And the Nazis just reject it entirely in some sense. They go back to the Roman Empire. You ever think about the Nazis wanted a third Reich? Do anybody know what the first two Reichs were? The Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. They saw themselves as the heirs of the Roman Empire. So they tried to go back to pre-Christianity in some sense, to have this like might is right worldview essentially, that's like, we're going to be the most powerful and strongest so we can just take over everything. And obviously that didn't last very long, so they were wrong. So yeah, here we are in the 21st century. I'm sorry about how grim all of that is, but that's unfortunately an account of how we got into this slightly confusing situation where there even is a secular world. I mean, in the medieval time, secular was a religious world to describe, ordinary time. There wasn't this huge political, economic thing that was separate from religious life. It structured everything you did. And so we're in a very unusual position, I think, historically. But I want to point out this 21st century kind of quiet revival that's happening, I suppose, that I was personally, I was raised as an atheist, in opposition to religion, really, in some sense. And so I couldn't be reached by those normal means like the gospel and a lot of evangelizing. But really through some of these kind of changes online, it managed to get through to me in a way that was very powerful. And so I think something is changing in some sense. If I can come back to the Catholic Church, pretty much anybody can, to be honest with you. It's like the review. So something that started changing is what I'm calling re-mythologization, okay? So guys like Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau, Tom Holland, who wrote Dominion, basically they're looking at Christian morality and they're going, this actually comes from somewhere. This is actually rooted in, a very specific account of this guy called Jesus Christ, who lived and died and was resurrected and left us a pattern of being that wasn't in the ancient Greeks, it wasn't in the Romans, it didn't exist in the world before he came along. And so they start connecting the morality again to the stories and to the mythology. I mean, Peterson's biblical series was a good example of this, where he kind of psychologizes it a little bit, like the tropological meaning. But in doing so, he opened it up to people that otherwise might have been opposed to it, like that wouldn't actually listen to the Bible or to anybody talk about it. Because he did it in this specific way of like, you have these moral values, they come from this specific thing, you should understand what this is. In some sense, you already are Christian, And Tom Holland, his book Dominion, does this historically. Like, he tells the story of the West and where it comes from and where our values come from. And that, if you look at the Roman Empire, I mean, it was barbarous. Like, it was really, a murderous tyranny, essentially. And so our own values and presuppositions in liberal democracies are really Christian. There's kind of no way to get out of it. And it's a way of reaching people that are otherwise opposed to the gospel. So that's the re-mythologization from morality to mythology. And what about the metaphysics? What's been happening? Nobody likes to start talking about metaphysics. It's okay, I understand. But in metaphysics, so within physics itself, physicists are now going, we need to stop being materialists. It's got us nowhere for 100 years. So they haven't made progress since Einstein. A lot of physicists now online, hardcore physicists that aren't like just, kind of half-assing it, like they're real physicists, they're going, we need to ditch materialism. Materialism is holding us back. The same thing has happened in neuroscience, which has, for the last 75 years, failed to solve the mind-body problem, failed to give an account of how consciousness reduces to physical processes. Many of them, neuroscience itself is a materialistic field, but within cognitive science, there's all types of new frameworks coming out. New frameworks that are returning to classical metaphysics. Classical metaphysics, which is Aristotle, which is Plato, which is Augustine, which is Aquinas, which is the stuff that Christianity is built on. This is really interesting. I'm a nerd, so this is very interesting to me, but there is a change happening here that hasn't been happening for a very long time. Even within biology, in a sense, they're turning to Aristotelian biology again in order to explain different kinds of causality, okay? It's like, turns out it's hard to explain living things if they're just billiard balls kind of rolling down the hill. It's like, no, we have goals, we pursue things, we're alive, things are meaningful to us, things are important to us, we care about some things, we don't care about others. So these things are happening kind of independently of each other. If you want to read on this, his book, Post-Reductionist Christianity, A Way Out of the Meaning Crisis, is very good. It is a difficult read, but it summarizes essentially these changes across these fields. So essentially what I'm proposing to you is that for the first time in 500 years, these three layers are coming back together in the West. Okay? The moral layer, the mythological layer, the metaphysical layer. Okay? And when these three are put together, a lot of the obstacles that have stopped people, scientific people, these kind of questions, these skepticisms, these cynicisms, are going to be reduced, basically. And I think this is why you see people converting now a lot because of the internet. Because these conversations are happening online, people are hearing them, they're becoming catechized by them in some sense, and then they're going, okay, this actually makes a lot more sense. In France, the recent conversions, they had like a record number in 20 years or something, 78% of the people baptized cited social media. They said that was the reason why. Okay, so a lot of these conversations have been happening online. This stuff is changing, and so there's now an opportunity for mission, which is what this whole conference is about. Essentially, like, now is the time to do it. Now is the time to reach people, and through the internet and through these new technologies. And if you can understand some of this stuff, some of this story, you can grasp it yourself. You can become kind of more normal, essentially. We don't really like the word normalizing, but if more people grasp this stuff, they can appeal to people that are outside of it. I mean, people that are in the secular, the so-called nuns. So like whenever I was born, atheists or non-religious people were 2% of the population in Ireland in 1994. Now it's over 25%. So all of those people that have been leaving church, that are falling into this kind of in-between space, essentially. And I think now through the internet, through these changes that are happening, there's an opportunity to reach those people that there hasn't been before, in a sense. And for the church, I think the real challenge is going to be how do you get these people off the internet? Like, how do you get them? So people come on the internet, they get catechized in some sense, they listen, they go, okay, this makes sense. How do I now get into a practice? They need other people that they trust in clergy, in relationships. I think there's a whole challenge here of utilizing the internet for mission, and then in turn getting people into real practices, real communities, real relationships. I was at the Jubilee in Rome now for the Digital Missionaries Jubilee, and Pope Leo gave us an audience and spoke to us at it, and said that this challenge, he gave us a challenge to mend the nets, he said. Essentially that through this work online we can start networks of love, networks of saving, networks of relationship, and we can offer people meaning in their lives again. Okay? And he really put forward that challenge that as evangelists now, we need to be in these spaces that people are in, and in turn bringing them offline so they can participate in actual religion. The internet isn't the point, but it's a great way of reaching people. Okay? So, if you want to learn more about this, I'm doing a course in Dublin on the 23rd of September until the 28th of August for 6 weeks. It's a free course, it's in Rathfarnham Parish. I'm going to go through in a bit more detail, kind of a philosophy light course essentially, so people can understand these things, like these three layers, how they work, how they're coming back together, why they fell apart in the first place. Because I think armed with this knowledge, we were talking about Michael's like faith as a gift. I think, for me anyway, I came to the faith through learning, faith is seeking understanding, but I think understanding can lead to faith. And through a greater understanding, you get a solid faith. Because there's going to be people with questions, there's going to be people like me when I was an atheist going, well, what the hell's up with this, and why are you eating this guy, and what's going on with this? And you need to be solid, you need to be, and I think the more solid we become in that will just radiate out. And you have a good chance of what Bishop Barron said, of re-evangelising Ireland. Because Ireland right now is a secular country, and I don't think it's going the right way. So, yeah. If you're interested, just go and talk to me after. Maybe if anybody has any questions, any thoughts, feelings, reflections. No? Everybody looks very worried. Yeah.
Okay, please, the course in question, is it an online?
No, it's in person, but the second one will be recorded. You can find it on my YouTube, it's just Mahon McCann. YouTube as well, I spend a lot of time talking to people that are working on this stuff, that are kind of at the forefront of a lot of the sciences and philosophy, like cognitive science, neuroscience, people that are changing this kind of narrative around reductive materialism that's just been so dominant for so long, and it is changing in those fields. So yeah, trying to bring those people together for other stuff. But yeah, anybody else? kind of connected in a way. I think Peterson was almost like a bridge. Like he was like in between, you know, religion and the non-religious world in some sense. He had deep appreciation for religious ideas, like spent his whole life studying them, trying to understand them. But at the same time, as he said, kind of hesitant, not necessarily a practicing Christian. And so he was a bridge really that could lie down, and literally millions of people have walked over him. Like millions of people have gone back to the faith because of him. And a lot of people, like Bishop Barron, did a lot of work with him where he realised this guy's really doing something. Like he's really reaching people that were unreachable otherwise. And I think that was because of his kind of liminal figure in a way. Like he wasn't, you know, a fully churched person in a way, but he wasn't fully unchurched, I don't know. And so he had that appeal. But now I think that's also kind of being his undoing a little bit, because I think that time has passed in some sense, and he kind of needs to pick, you know, is he in or is he out? But I think he really does try and live it, to be fair to Peterson. Like, I think he really does, he's a sincere person in every way. And I think he's scared to call himself a Christian because he knows what that means. Like, I think he knows how actually significant a title that is to put on yourself in some sense. And yeah, my family. So interestingly, my dad both of my parents were Catholics, and they lapsed out essentially, both for kind of different reasons, like quite opposed to it, very like, you know, that it was essentially just like an old fairy tale or something made up to control people, and it's all nonsense, and so we'll get out of that and we become kind of enlightened and rational and wise or whatever. But my dad has since now returned to the faith, and he was actually my godfather for my baptism, so that was really special. Similarly through Peterson and through kind of his own, I suppose, journey with the faith, coming back to it in that way. Haven't got my mother yet, try convert her, maybe weekly. I'm working on like tough cookie. She's good. Yeah. And a lot of people, I mean, the initial reactions, people thought I'd lost my mind essentially, probably. It's like, you kind of got nuts. But whenever I talk to people about it, they're like, oh yeah, this actually makes tons of sense, this is great. You know, appealing to me in a way that I didn't think, you know, they just kind of, which to be fair to me is like, you almost put Catholicism in a box or something like that. You build a gate around it, you go, well that's not true, I know for a fact there's nothing there, so you'll go and be a Buddhist, or you'll go and do yoga, or you'll do anything basically but look at that. But then once you break down that gate, you're like, wow, this is the greatest tradition that ever lived, and like it's got all the gold, all of the stuff. I mean, it's called the greatest tradition for a reason, like. But it's just a prejudice, like that's it really. At the end of the day.
In your work at DCU, are you able to find people that are approaching you to engage in an honest discussion about religion or how that fits into their worldview? And do you feel pushback from the school itself?
I haven't found any from the school yet, to be honest. No, but I'm in the School of Theology and Philosophy as well, so a lot of people would be in religious traditions there anyway. It's kind of the two schools are connected. But out in general, on the internet as well, you get a lot of people that are very like, somebody the other week wished my whole family get pancreatic cancer because of my evangelizing online. So yeah, I mean, you get people that are negative to it, but it usually seems like it's a them thing, you know, they've got something going on. But no, mostly I found people are more interested than I thought. People message me a lot on social media platforms and stuff, and I put up my testimony and saying like I've been praying and I've been going to mass, like I'm kind of exploring it. You know, I'm starting to believe in God again, and then I kind of like, all right, well, let's go to mass, like get into the actual practices and doing it. But I noticed a real need there and real interest.
How important when Peter 3:15 is, right?
Yeah.
To give a reason for why we believe.
Exactly, and
to be able to equip ourselves to do that.
Totally, and I think so many scientists like Richard Dawkins and stuff like that have just gotten away with murder, man, for just with the worst arguments of all time. Like there's no evidence for God. You're like, God is reality itself. Like, what evidence are we going to give for existence? Like, the fact that anything exists is evidence for existence. Like, they're just, yeah, he thinks it's the Loch Ness Monster or something like that. And, like, yeah, but they got way further than they should have, to be honest. Like, the New Ages with fairly, you know, simplistic stuff. Yeah, sorry, any more questions? I think. Do you have time? Yeah.
Yep. Are you involved in any kind of media outlets like here interact with any like Grit or?
Yeah, media outlets. I did with EWTN, the Catholic News Network. Did some stuff with them on the baptism, they were interested because there was record numbers of adults baptised in Ireland this year, essentially. It was the most they'd ever had, so they were interested in that. And yeah, I've done another couple of radio interviews and things like that. I was on News Talk at breakfast show. I was supposed to go on the live line, but they double booked me. I would love to go on there. It would have been perfect. Like, yeah. Okay, we're done. All right, thank you very much.